But England, I think, is the most retarded in this of probably all the countries that I've been in. Although I think also globally, I have not yet found a country that is not contaminated by the mind-body split yet. And I think, a lot of what we call progressive education of different kinds, hands-on learning, activity-based learning, experiential learning, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning. These are all kind of attempts to escape from the gravitational pull of the intellectualized view of learning and education, and to reintroduce something that generates more enthusiasm, that is more embodied, that has more feeling, that has more meaning, that has more spontaneity, that has more significance to it than sitting there learning that there are three types of triangle.
Because that's exactly what I mean by a kind of body-mind literacy, that you have the language for your experiences, you understand your own responses, that if I get this way, maybe I do need to go climb a tree or go to the bathroom or eat something or just stretch and move, or maybe I need to really calm down, that I can learn to interpret my own signals and responses more accurately according to the situation, and actually to respond more appropriately to what's happening. And I think in order to do that, I have to understand that my body signals are important and valuable, and they tell me things that are useful. And I think not all of us are on the same page yet.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Bodies of learning, David, talk to me.
I am excited about this. It's a fascinating book, but it brings together all sorts of elements of my past: mysticism, politics, education. I'm right in there with it. I think this could be the great coming together podcast of our times.
Yeah, it does feel like the glue, doesn't it? It feels like the glue that holds all kinds of things together. We've been making connections with previous episodes. I also feel like I want to do a 2-hour podcast about your history of mystical practices.
And your own on glue sniffing, obviously.
So yes, we're very, very excited and honoured to be having this conversation, which we'll be recording very shortly with Guy Claxton. His third return. He's the most featured person on this podcast, and Emily Poel, who's written this really interesting book, Bodies of Learning: How Embodiment Science Transforms Education. So without further ado, let's get into this conversation. I feel like we should check in with our bodies first of all, as a way to just recognize this topic that we're about to embark on. I don't know, Emily, I don't want to put you on the spot, but perhaps you could lead us through a short exercise.
Why not? James, I'm really impressed. You're the first person who has led us down this road or this path so soon. Yes, so you can hear the excitement in my voice. I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for the invitation. And I would say let's just all take 3 deep breaths with a slightly longer exhale. So inhaling through the nose and exhaling through the mouth. And that already changes something, right?
Yeah, the long out breath is a thing, isn't it? It's like sends a message to your nervous system that it's the thing that people often do just before they go to sleep, isn't it? They do this sort of long out breath, and it seems to be just like you're safe enough to sleep now. You're not going to be eaten. It seems to send like a message to yourself.
Yes.
Exactly.
And there you have the effect of body on mind right there.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Well, thank you for that. So I hope that you're all sitting or standing. I'm standing personally, comfortably. And so, yes, really welcome. So let's just do very quick introduction. Like our listeners are probably more familiar with Guy, almost certainly familiar, especially if they've heard your previous episodes and know your work. But let's just do a quick introduction from each of you for anybody who is new to you. So let's go Emily and then Guy.
Sure. So my name is Emily Poel, and I'm an embodiment practitioner and trainer living in Berlin, Germany. And bodywork practitioner and trainer means that I work with people one-on-one in classes and workshops and teams and organizations and different projects, but always bringing an embodied lens to whatever's happening. So I also work with leaders on professional development topics. I'm also extremely interested in how to create more embodied learning environments. And on the school topic, my daughter's in 2nd grade, so I've gotten very interested in embodiment at school recently.
Good. Yes, well, I will be known to some of your listeners. Guy Claxton, trained as an experimental psychologist, PhD in psycholinguistics, very kind of hard-nosed in my approach to what was then the beginning, we're talking about the early 1970s, the beginnings of cognitive psychology, and then branched out into all kinds of different bits of psychology, but finding my natural home in the complexities of education and teaching and learning, and with an abiding interest in the learnability of learning itself, rather than seeing one's learning performance as a reflection of some relatively fixed and innate capacity. I now see it, with good reason, as reflecting a whole constellation of beliefs and facilities and attitudes and experiences which either expand and make more sophisticated and make more powerful one's being as a learner, or on the other hand, sometimes diminishing, cramping, or even kind of blocking or stymieing one's ability as a learner. So my concern with embodiment really is an extension of that interest.
Yes, great stuff. Thank you. And your work has been so influential on my own thinking and practice over the years. So I'm very grateful to you for that.
Well, I think I'd want to say before we start, just huge congratulations to both of you on the book. I think it's an absolutely fascinating read, and I found it incredibly eye-opening. I also found it quite nostalgic. It kind of took me back to a much earlier period in my life. In late 60s, early 70s, yes, I am that old and still upright. And lots of the different cross currents and elements that were around at that time. So there was a real sort of comforting element around that. But I think it's a really exciting and interesting read. And I know, James, that you've been reflecting a lot on the whole mind-body split and thinking a lot about that. And maybe that's something we'll come back to later on in the discussion. But Emily, you're the one that kicked this off. This is all down to you. You sent an email to Guy Claxton, allegedly out of the blue. So share with us what prompted you to reach out to him, apart from obviously his intense animal and intellectual magnetism. But apart from that, what was it that prompted you to reach out to him? And how did that email exchange lead to writing the book?
Well, what happened was, coming off the end of COVID, I was co-curating an online series, and it was called Body Talks and Insight Labs. And that series gave me the reason to be able to email just all kinds of people that I thought might be interesting out of the blue. And I had read Intelligence in the Flesh a few years before, and Guy was on my list as someone who's talking about embodiment in a very new and coherent way. And I wrote him an email. He answered the email, which I didn't even really know if that would work out. And he agreed to be a guest in our series. And then Guy and I had some great talks preparing for that event and then following up afterwards. And it was actually Guy who said, we should write a book about this. And I was caught off guard by that book invitation. So I started it, but then Guy's the one who actually brought it into book form.
Right, interesting. Nobody's ever said that to me, and I think I'd just like to note on behalf of both James and I that clearly we weren't interesting enough to be on your email list, so we'll just let that go, and we'll keep you on the podcast despite that.
Thank you.
Guy, you've clearly written about this territory before in your previous book, which Emily's just mentioned. Why your mind and needs your body much more than it thinks? What do you feel was still missing or unsaid that led you into this book?
I've had a bit of a dual career, really. There's part of me is a kind of, to put it at its most grand, a theoretical life scientist. I've kept up my training as a psychologist through into our transition into being a cognitive scientist, but have always been interested in the malleability of human abilities and human capacities, and particularly expanding our concept of intelligence to include things that are less deliberate, less conscious, less intellectual than the IQ type image of intelligence. And so that book, the Intelligence in the Flesh book, was me writing more as a synthesizer within the genre of cognitive science. Very little of it is addressed to education. So as always with any book, James may have had the same experience. Every time you finish a book, there's a little tail of something left over which you haven't had enough time for, or you haven't been able to squeeze in. And this book, and the happy coincidence of my meeting Emily, gave me a chance to take that work, that interest in the embodiment of intelligence, if you like, and bring it back into my other world, which is of being someone very interested in the psychology of education, and particularly in the whole realm of how schools and how education can function, not just to use learning as a way of gaining knowledge, but to see learning itself as something that is capable of expansion and refinement and augmentation, and to raise the question of whether education could, and then we introduce the possibility of the moral should, be more concerned with the expansion of one's learning capacity rather than merely harnessing whatever learning capacity you've got to fill your head with knowledge. So this is, if you like, the educationally oriented companion volume to Intelligence in the Flesh.
Got it. Lovely. Thank you. So and I'd like to echo what David said. Congratulations on it. It's a really, really interesting, very cogent, powerfully argued narrative that you developed, really. And so let's work our way through that narrative or that argument that you lay out in the book. And it really starts with chapter 2, which is about the mind-body schism. And as David said, I have been reflecting a lot on how the mind-body schism plays out in my own life. Before we started recording, we were talking about how the physical realm impacts on people's ability to be punctual or not so punctual for things. And in all kinds of ways, it plays out in my own life. But let's start with the big picture. Looking beyond education, you sort of talk about this mind-body split is something that runs through the history of Western civilization. Often it's associated with Descartes, with this sort of Cartesian dualism of the body and the soul, the body and the mind being separate things which somehow sort of interact, but that are somehow seen as distinct. So could you just let's start with you, Guy, on this one, just to make the case for the mind-body split more broadly how does this show up, and what do you well, I don't know. I mean, take it in whichever direction you would like to go. And this is a massive topic, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is. I mean, it goes the way back. I mean, it's a whole other book to write about the intellectual history, which some people have done. I'm reminded of a book. I can't remember the name of the author, Richard somebody or other, who wrote a book called something like The Intellectual History of the West. Goes back to Plato and before. And it is this sort of cluster of beliefs you've already mentioned, that mind and body are somehow separate. I mean, Descartes is more complex than he's often painted, because he had a very strong interest in spirituality and in intuition. But he does write things in his meditations like, there is nothing in the mind that is of the body, and nothing in the body that is of the mind. And that encapsulates this trend, really, in the development of Western thought, that somehow or other mind is not only separate from the body, but is, in some sense, mind is the seat of intelligence. And by inference, body is not the seat of intelligence. So mind is in control. The mind is proactive. Mind makes decisions. Mind issues orders to which the menial minions of the body politely respond or occasionally rebel. And this goes along with the core beliefs in Christianity, that somehow mind and soul are quite strongly related, that mind is higher or more superior or more pure. Going back to Plato's cave, the idea that true knowledge is not the body is somehow rather ephemeral and corrupt and personal, too much influenced by emotion, whereas the mind itself is pure and abstract. The mind is basically built around geometry and calculus and algebra and things and rational, disinterested discourse. And that split, mind is knowledgeable and rational, mind is conscious, body is largely unconscious, mind's job is to control the body. I think part of the argument that we begin with is that you can see strong echoes of this in many aspects of the way that school, when in the 17th and 18th centuries, when the idea of school as a separate institution was imported or imbibed a lot of those beliefs. I mean, crudely, at its most obvious, look at the hierarchy of esteem of different subjects in the curriculum, and you'll find that hierarchy corresponds very much to how much or how little body is involved. So at the top you have maths, which you can more or less do with your eyes and your brain and a piece of paper and a pencil. So the amount of body is minimal, and then you slide down the ladder of intelligence until you come up with things like design technology and physical education, dance and drama, which undeniably have a lot more body about them and also have a lot less status, as judged by the number of periods in the average week devoted to them, as judged by how early you can drop them, as judged by the English baccalaureate, so beloved of some educators recently in the UK. Yeah. So this hierarchy of esteem, that somehow or other the academic is what we should all be aspiring to. And I remember in a small article in a local newspaper about a girl who had a young woman who had a place at Cambridge, but declined to take it up because she wanted to do a BTEC in hair and beauty. And she was presented as absolutely crackers. This was just sheer madness, sheer act of self-denial or self-mutilation, something like that. It was inconceivable that anybody in their right mind would make that choice. And that thinking is pretty much endemic, isn't it, in the way, even down to today, where, many schools are trying to introduce more esteem into other kinds of activities than the most intellectual ones. Nevertheless, come examination time, come university entrance time, it's very much sitting at a funny little table on your own in a large gym, doing like writing, explaining, recalling, remembering, analyzing, calculating. Those are the things that open up opportunities for you. And however good you are as a dancer or a carpenter, they don't count for as much. So that's the basic body, the cornerstones of education. And we talk in the book about how this mind-body mindset, if you like, rather than a body mindset, has shaped very much our understanding of some of the core concepts on which any form of education must be based. That is to say, the nature of intelligence, the nature of learning, the nature of thinking, the nature of knowledge, the nature of memory, all of those concepts, which are powerful cornerstones of our educational system, have incorporated in them this intellectualized notion of the mind.
Yes.
Let's not lose the irony that you managed to smuggle in there when you talked about the culmination of people sitting at a desk in a gym.
Yes.
Right.
And there's a real profound irony there, isn't there? That,
yes, exactly.
All gym activity stops
Yeah.
unless the weather's good enough to do it outside. So there's something really powerful around that hierarchy, isn't there?
Yes,
it's almost the perfect visual image, isn't it, of this, like the gym that's turned into an exam hall.
Yeah.
And there's even a split in our relationship to the physical. And I'll throw this one over to you, Emily, about so like embodied ideas are like, our language is littered with embodied ideas. We reach for an idea, we shrug off a suggestion, we bounce ideas around, we juggle tasks and so on. We use these sort of like physical embodiment metaphors all the time. And I know you write about this in the book. We talk about making things concrete, those metaphors do that. They help to make abstract things feel more concrete and tangible. And even, of course, concrete is a metaphor there. But also then if you think about swear words, like the language that people seem to find most objectionable or disgusting are often parts of the body, right? Or bodily functions. What does this tell us, do you think, about the mind-body split and how deep it goes?
Well, I think that it just shows how far below the body is, and that everything that is connected to the body and of the body is obviously lower and less worth and of less value. For me, that would be the quick answer. But I think then we get into things of the body, things that are of the feminine, things that a lot of those swear words are also misogynistic and directed towards the female. The female is also more closely associated with the body. That is a rabbit hole, and it probably an interesting discussion. But I think the habits of mind that we're grown in come out in things like that.
Right.
You're mentioning the way in which even abstract, even intellectual language, even highfalutin language, when you look into it, you don't have to look very far, is saturated. Another physical analogy, saturated with concrete fundamentals. And one of the bits of embodiment science, which we'll come on to, which illustrates this very clearly, is the idea is a nice little experiment. People are put into an MRI machine and just sentences are flashed up to them, and they just have to make a judgment about whether they're well-formed sentences or not. Things that are of interest is if you flash up a sentence like John grasped the hammer, automatically the bit of his brain that is to do with clenching a fist lights up. And it lights up almost equally as much if the sentence was John grasped the argument. So there's an almost involuntary, it's as if even our abstract use of words, wherever possible, there's a kind of bit like the Jack and the Beanstalk, and automatically you could slide back down the beanstalk and find a grounding, is a word that's often used in this context, to find that those abstract concepts, if you ask for people to talk about love or democracy or truth or something, they'll very quickly start telling you about personal experiences or feelings in the body or whatever it may be. So even things that seem to live at the most mindful end of the spectrum, the science and a lot of the work in cognitive science now is showing that even those things like rational discourse and argumentation and so on have not freed themselves from their rootedness in the concrete nature of our own bodies and our own first-hand experience. I think, if I can just throw this in here, that the way in which Piaget has been construed has done a big injustice in education. He identified several different steps, if you like, on the ladder, from very physical, very motor, very movement-based, very sensory-based ways of thinking and feeling, through up to the formal, what he called formal operations. Well and good, but the assumption that has almost always gets smuggled into that is that as we go up the ladder, so we kick away the rungs behind us. So we outgrow these childish ways of thinking and learning. And part of what embodiment science is showing us is, yes, these things like rational thought or imagination are outgrowths of our most physical being, but they retain their juice, their energy, their meaningfulness through their connection, through their rootedness, their groundedness in those aspects of our being. So yes, we develop more sophisticated tools for thinking and learning, but it's quite entirely wrong and misguided to think that we, as we develop more intellectual ways of learning and thinking and knowing, that means that we can discard things which are earlier or more childish or more primitive. Part of what the science is showing us is that we develop a more multiple set of ways of being smart, not moving from one set of ways to another and neglecting the first ones. And I think that's a very important insight for educators up and down the age range.
I think there's some really interesting elements in some of the things that you've said, Guy. So clearly you're talking about this as something that's part of a long philosophical tradition of debate and all of that. And then at the same time, you're quoting examples of, for instance, the EBAC. And it's really interesting when you read the book that lots of the people that you mention and champion, Brunner, you've just mentioned Piaget in that last section. There's a whole range of people you mentioned who would have been dismissed by Michael Gove, the Secretary of State for Education, as key parts of the blob. And there's been a real intensification of the dichotomy that you're dealing with that's coincided with the rise of neoliberalism. And I would argue there's been a strong political commitment, particularly in England, to have this very narrow transactional curriculum because it sits with these values.
Yes.
So, whatever the long-term debate, there's a sense for me that it's been supercharged in the current context, particularly in English education, but in many other countries as well. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Absolutely. I think I'm glad you use English rather than British, because I think I've come to think that the English education system, as controlled and driven by a relatively small number of people who are very comfortable inhabiting the intellectual zone, and some of them seem to have really cut themselves adrift from their own physiology in some ways. Ken Robinson has this wonderful thing about if you want to experience what an out of the body experience is like, take yourself down to the disco in the evening at an academic conference where you will see grown men and women writhing uncontrollably to music off the beat.
Can I just point out that there is an incredibly revealing YouTube video of Michael Gove dancing?
Yes, exactly.
Which proves that he may well also be academic.
Yes, exactly. But England, I think, is the most retarded in this of probably all the countries that I've been in. Although I think also globally, I have not yet found a country that is not contaminated by the mind-body split yet. And I think, a lot of what we call progressive education of different kinds, hands-on learning, activity-based learning, experiential learning, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, these are all kind of attempts to escape from the gravitational pull of the intellectualized view of learning and education, and to reintroduce something that is that generates more enthusiasm, that is more embodied, that has more feeling, that has more meaning, that has more spontaneity, that has more significance to it than sitting there learning that there are 3 types of triangle.
Yes. And so in an attempt to reframe this sort of very disembodied mindset, if you like, of the mind and thought and rationality and so on, you use this phrase throughout the book, body mind, as a way to sort of to represent, so like, what do you feel, how does your body mind feel about X, Y, or Z? And you note that it might take some adjusting to get to this word. At the end of the mind body schism chapter, you sort of say, how do you react to the term body mind? Is it new for you? Do you like it? Do you find it a bit odd? Can you see the point? We understand that it might take a bit of getting used to. And our listeners may be finding the same. And it does, you can almost feel a sort of like a crunch, because it's like the body and the mind are totally separate ideas in our minds. And to think the body mind as one thing, there is a bit of a jarring response there. Emily, how does this go down in the world that you embody, as it were, as a practitioner in this area? Do you find this idea of a body mind a tough sell? What's your experience of this?
It's definitely a tough sell. And I think it can be very irritating at first. And I'm just actually so happy that Guy and I arrived there and agree on using it, because what I found is the more you use it, the more you get used to it and the more normal it gets.
Right.
And though I think it's very hard to just make the shift to the term body mind without collecting some of your own experiences relating to it. So I think there is a kind of personal or individual learning process of, maybe it's even following the prompts in the book that are meant to kind of guide you into some reflection, some experiencing, some trying it out for yourself, so that it's not just a theoretical discussion, is that the right term or not, or how, that we're not stuck there, but that we collect some experiences that we can then reflect on and then see if that makes sense, or why it might be useful to even try out that term, because maybe it gives you a different entry point into all kinds of other things. So yes, hard sell. I think kind of personal experimentation needed in order to keep finding even your own language for some of those things.
Yeah, it definitely does get easier. I've been on a bit of a journey with this myself. My partner in crime is Kate McAllister, and she runs like a barefoot unschool. It's actually mentioned towards the back of your book. She runs this barefoot unschool in the Dominican Republic, which is very much an embodied way of being. The children, if they self-regulate all the time, and if they feel like they need to go and climb a tree, they go and climb a tree, and then they come back and they can go to the loo whenever they want, and so on. They're not restrained in that way. And she sort of talks a lot about, when you ask people, like, how does this decision that you're unsure about, how does it feel in your tummy, say? And if somebody's never thought about that before, they just go, what are you talking about? How does it feel in my tummy? That's not even a thing. But the more that you start to develop a vocabulary and a sense of this is like interoception that you talk about throughout the book, that actually you start to develop like a two-way stream of communication between your mind and your body, and you start to develop a sort of fluency. And so it does, I think I agree with you that it does become more natural as time goes on. Go on.
Well, and I think because that's exactly what I mean by a kind of body-mind literacy, that you have the language for your experiences, you understand your own responses, that if I get this way, maybe I do need to go climb a tree or go to the bathroom or eat something or just stretch and move, or maybe I need to really calm down, that I can learn to interpret my own signals and responses more accurately according to the situation, and actually to respond more appropriately to what's happening. And I think in order to do that, I have to understand that my body signals are important and valuable, and they tell me things that are useful. And I think not all of us are on the same page yet about that. And that the whole body side, again, tends to get excluded, devalued. It's a nice to have, but we don't need it. The real point is this over here. We need the exam results. And I think the two can absolutely nourish each other. And ideally, they're both working together in the best possible way, which it sounds like in this barefoot school, that's definitely what's happening.
Yeah, there's a really good, you're going to come in there, Guy?
Yes, I think there's a, I mean, if you look at the way people are thinking about the brain is changing. I mean, the big shift was all in our understanding of these matters was the introduction of neuroscience and the assumption that the brain was the kind of center of operations, like the chief executive of the body, making all the decisions and issuing commands. And there's been a radical rethink, which is quite quickly percolating, for example, into the medical profession, that actually we need to look at the body not just as a collection of bones and skin and organs, but as an incredibly dynamic, complex system of information and communication. We are highly complex bodies, and we can't function in concert. We can't function as a whole body unless all these different sources and streams of information are integrated. So there's a shift now instead of thinking about the brain as the kind of center of operations, as the headquarters, we think about the brain as the kind of chat room in which all these different influences from your heart, from your lungs, from your eyes, from your ears, from your gut, from your muscles, from your fascia, and so on, all these different influences have a place, tributaries, where they can come together and in some kind of not miraculous but highly complex way resolve the messages, the information, the needs, the requests that are coming in on those information streams into a good answer to the question of what as a whole body am I going to do next? How am I going to act in concert? So the brain becomes seen as a chat room, which is entirely dependent upon all this information, which is looping into and out of the brain all the time. Some of it through our special senses, through our smell, through our touch, through our sound, some of it coming from our internal organs. And the organ of intelligence, which is one of the meanings of the word mind, isn't it? The mind is what makes us smart. The organ of intelligence, therefore, has to be seen as including all these tributaries or contributaries of information, which are based in the body and which are completely integral to the functioning of the intelligence system. That's the shift that's happening. I recently read a very interesting book called The Immune Mind, which is about the way this kind of thinking is rapidly seeping into the world of medicine. And it's quite a radical shift, but it's being very welcomed. so that because people can now have a way of thinking about complex disorders like ME or long COVID or those things that defy explanation within the fragmented view of the body. And it's high time, we think, that these understandings also seep into education as well as into medicine.
Hello, Earthlings. This podcast is brought to you by Crown House Publishing. Crown House have published many of the most influential books of recent years, certainly many that have been the most influential on my own thinking. Things like When the Adults Change by Paul Dix, A Curriculum of Hope by Dr. Deborah Kidd, and The Wonderful Botheredness by Howell Roberts. They have also published an amazing card-based resource called Activate, a professional learning resource designed to help people develop their thinking and their practice around self-regulated learning, which is designed on my own doctoral research and which I created with my erstwhile colleagues at the Center for Educational Leadership in the UCL Institute of Education. Anyway, as listeners to the podcast, or indeed viewers, you can receive a 20% discount on all titles from the Crown House website if you use the promo code REPOD20. That's REPOD20, all caps. That offer does exclude bundles and existing promotions, though. So head over to crownhouse.co.uk and treat yourself, or perhaps a colleague, or indeed 10 or 20. That's crownhouse.co.uk, REPOD20. Okay, let's get back to today's pod.
Indeed, which we will get to shortly. So we're firmly now moving into the next chapter, which is about embodiment science. So the next few chapters are on this, and just to sort of to underscore what you just said, the embodiment science chapter starts with a wonderful quote by Andy Clark, which I'll just share from our listeners and viewers. Human experience and human thinking are orchestrated from the inside by neuronal activity in the dense network of brain-body interactions, and from the outside by the highly structured social and technological worlds in which we live and act. This creates a circular causal web in which mind is constantly porous to body and world. Really great language, that, isn't it? It's such a vivid description of what's going on here, and it really resonates, and I'm sure that it will be doing with many of our listeners. And you start to sort of have lots of realizations. Like this morning, I was just like getting the sausages out of the fridge that I used to give the dog his drugs. And as soon as I did that, I was triggered to a memory that I was listening to a podcast last night when I put the sausages in the fridge, and somehow that memory was linked to this location of sausages in the fridge. And so this stuff is really, you start to really notice it. So at the start of this chapter, you start by acknowledging that there are lots of sort of faddy and new agey ideas around sort of mind-body connections. People, get with the vibrations, man, and all of that stuff that have not survived scientific scrutiny. But there is also this growing field of serious study. And, we've had Mary Helen Imodino Yang on the podcast before, and her PhD supervisor, Antonio Damasio, I know is a big figure here, Andy Clark, who we just heard from. And you say that in this chapter, you're going to lay out the hard-nosed case for embodiment science. And before we do that, I just want to ask perhaps an impertinent question, which you partly address in the book, which is that somebody said recently, if something calls itself a science, it's probably not a science. Like chemistry doesn't call itself chemistry science, But I face this thing in my work around implementation. It calls itself implementation science, and I don't think it really is a science. And so I'd just like to get a sense, before we get into some of the studies and so on, what would be your honest appraisal of this field of study? Is it sort of a nascent, emerging thing? Would you say it's fairly established? Is this a contested phrase? Are there many people who would say, like, I work in the field of embodiment science? Or is this language that you are seeking to promote through the book that you're hoping will catch on? And what's your sense as to where embodiment science is?
I don't think we should start to cast aspersions on the notion of science. Neuroscience is entirely respectable. Cognitive science, people don't have much of a problem with. Science, the etymology of science, is simply understanding. And my understanding of science is that it is the pursuit of knowledge or understanding within strict bounds of reasoning and evidencing. And that applies to an awful lot of fields. I think we hamstring ourselves if we don't include, for example, anthropology, if we don't include the work of cognitive philosophers like Daniel Dennett, like Andy Clark himself. It's like these are powerful, intellectually credible contributions to the complex project of trying to understand and articulate ourselves better. So yes, you might argue that implementation science and embodiment science and so on are trying to give themselves some kind of status by calling themselves science. But I think in terms of the original and the proper use of the term science, they're perfectly valid. Our argument is more with the word cognition.
Right.
The word cognition started to be popular in the 1960s when I was first studying psychology, and cognitive psychology emerged as a reaction to behaviorism, behavioral. But it was all about intellectual functions. It was all about memorizing, conscious memorizing, deliberate problem solving, IQ type questions, language understanding. That was what cognitive psychology was all about. So unfortunately, the word cognitive or cognition has become imbued with the very kind of intellectual presuppositions which we want to challenge in the book. So the phrases that are commonly used in this area, that's to say embodiment science, embodied cognition, or the phrase that's often used is 4E cognition, which we'll come back to in a minute when we talk about the E's. Carry forward that word cognition, which I think has unfortunate semi-conscious presuppositions about what it is that we're talking about. So we preferred the term embodiment science as being more neutral on that account and giving us more scope to include more embodied pursuits and not to smuggle in the prioritization of the intellectual again. It's a hybrid discipline, like a lot of other interesting disciplines like biochemistry or bioengineering or what have you. You know, the world is awash with things that don't fall into the school categories of physics, chemistry and biology. Intellectual endeavor is much more multifaceted and much more interesting than that now. So I will defend our right to use the phrase embodiment science without having people trying to throw mud at it.
Thank you. I consider my impertinent wrists slapped. And so Emily, like, so what do you have anything to add here? Like before you started on this endeavor with Guy, is this sort of, were you thinking about this in terms of the science of embodiment?
Well, I discovered 4E cognition, I don't know, maybe around 2017 or 18. My husband and I have a company called Embodiment at Work, where we're teaching in different corporate contexts and work settings about how to bring more embodied awareness into your typical workday. I vastly underestimated how hard that was going to be. So when I found 4E, I thought, great, this actually describes what we're trying to do. That if we start with these 4Es of embodied, enactive, embedded, and extended, it gives us a little map, and we can say, I'm a body moving in the world. I'm enacting my thinking processes, and I'm interacting all the time, and I'm always embedded in my personal context and situation. My thinking actually is never separate from it, and I'm always using tools and other people to kind of extend my abilities in the world. And just those 4 E's, they already give you a really different picture of what's going on than usual. And for us, it was a great invitation into walking meetings or the standing desk, or even things that are still very basic kind of changes that make our posture and our movements during the workday different than just the sitting in the chair at the screen. If you have that entry point, then and I think we also hoped it would kind of remove a little bit of the anxiety around trying out a more embodied approach to things, because it can make people a little bit nervous, or oh no, then I might feel too much, or things will get out of control, or that those kinds of worries can be in there. And I think I thought, I don't know if I should even say this, I thought that if I could explain it well enough, and the science also says the same thing, I thought it would make it easier for people to get on board or to try things out. That was not necessarily the case. And I think that was where I started learning more about creating a safe environment in which to try things out that might be a little bit awkward or new. And so then the different layers were sort of in there, but in talking to Guy and working on the book, I got a much larger picture and a hugely more interesting landscape of all the different fields and research and things that Guy can so easily draw from. It's just been a pleasure for me to learn much more about the kind of interdisciplinary landscape of things that's going on, and to give me language for it, because again, I think we need accurate language for our experiences, and then we're rolling. So if we can connect those two things, then it's already a different ballgame.
Yeah. You've got some really interesting examples in the book of what I would kind of tend to talk about as spliffy science. So there's like that. Man, you know, like when kids sit in their hands, you know, like they really struggle to speak. And they've done a study on that. And yeah, scuba divers, if you ask a scuba diver about words, they remember them better underwater, man. It's like totally amazing. I mean, how spaced out is that? And then another thing is like people ask to make character judgments about a series of mugshots. Like they make more positive judgments if they're holding a warm coffee. I think, who knew? So there's a lot of that kind of stuff, I think, in your examples. And I'm interested in how far you feel there are limits to the extent that we can push these kind of findings, and where that kind of evidence starts to get a bit shaky.
Well, we draw a lot on the empirical research. I think the important, let's get back up just a minute or two. I think it's really important to have the scientific background, because it doesn't always lead us in the direction of things that are brand new. It also provides a kind of platform that gives legitimacy and rigor and integration to a whole lot of things that teachers have been doing for a long time, but without a strong sense of their own rationale. I think that's one of the reasons why educational reform, and particularly progressive educational reform, has tended to be a bit ephemeral or a bit fragmented, and to not scale up in the way that we would perhaps have liked it to do, is because it hasn't had that sense of a strong intellectual underpinning. Nothing that we're saying is anti-intellectual. All we're talking about is a model of intelligence which is intellect plus lots of other things. So no, we shouldn't be misread as some kind of hippie manifesto in this book. So, and I think one of the reasons why educational reform or educational innovation has for a long time been so patchy and as I say, dependent upon brave individuals, or harking back to Montessori or whoever else it might be, is that there hasn't been this coherence. Like, what is it that brings inquiry learning and hands-on learning and experiential learning and all of these things together? Well, now we know what it is. What it is that all these different progressive forms have in common is that they're trying to re-legitimate the body. They're trying to bring the body back in a whole lot of different ways. So, and I think the science, in a way, it's not paradoxical, but it might sound it very superficially, that it's really important that in a culture which pays greater heed to the scientific justification for things, that we can also provide a scientific justification for things that are not themselves as rational or as intellectual as they might otherwise be. So I think that's important. So the kinds of research that you were quoting, David, are just examples. They're not kind of cut and dried. What we're trying to do is to draw together, to illustrate for teachers the broad range, the knowledge base, which is rapidly expanding over the last 30 years, which leads us, we argue, towards a new view, an enriched view, well, new but also old in some ways or other, view of human nature, which underpins different thoughts, not just about the practicalities of education, but about the very purposes of education. Should education be about expanding, so to speak, the ensemble or the orchestra of intelligent instruments that we have at our disposal, rather than narrowing them down to the rather noisy brass section of the intellectual, the brass band, if you like, of the rather loud and shrill tools of the intellect. No, we also want the double basses, we also want the timpani, we also want the piccolos. And if we can help young people develop this much more multifaceted view, that to be fully intelligent, we need access to our feelings, to our embodied values, to our intuitions, to our imagination, to our ability to resonate with other human beings. If we don't want an education system which from the word go denigrates or precludes all the rest of the orchestra. So that's why the science is important, is it enables us to talk about this broader, richer, more fully intelligent underpinning to an intelligent life, not just to becoming a proud member of Mensa, but to somebody who actually lives in a way that is smart and responsible and adventurous and fulfilling, and if the best of all possible worlds, rather wise. Intellect on its own is often not very wise. It descends into a kind of cleverness which lacks heart, which lacks depth, which lacks context, which lacks fellow feeling. And we imagine, as many other people are doing, as the IB is doing at the moment, a world in which we are confidently nurturing the development of people who are better at being alive than many of us and our forebears have been.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I mean, for what it's worth, I think that it's perhaps a bit unfair to characterize those findings as spliffy. Like I think that they're just different ways of shining a lens on, a bit like my sausage in the fridge thing. They're just different ways of shining a lens on the fact that things that we think of as being mental, rational things are often really influenced by the physical environment. I remember reading a study a while ago, which isn't in your book, I don't think, but it was about some Israeli judges, and it was a study of like the extent to which they could grant people parole or something, and it was usually they have a peak about an hour and a half after breakfast. When their blood sugar level is just at the right level, they're much more lenient
Yes.
than at other times. And there are many examples like that, and I think that that's what each of those examples goes to show. But I'm not really I don't really feel that we've done embodiment science enough justice here. So I want to just give you an opportunity to just set out the case. And again, you can take this in a number of directions, but there are a couple of things that spring to mind. One is something that you alluded to a moment ago, Guy, which was about the idea of the brain as a predictive processing machine. This idea that that the brain, the mind, the body mind is constantly running like simulations of the world and updating them. That feels quite central to the argument of the book, but it's also quite a difficult thing to get your head around. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, to perhaps unpack that a bit. And perhaps linked to this is Damasio's idea of the somatic rudder, this idea that emotion, how we feel about things, is absolutely key. The so-called salience network of the world, right? The extent to which we care about something really influences our ability to learn about that thing. And so I want to just throw this back to you, just sort of like to make the strong case for embodiment science. What are some of the key findings that have shaped your thinking here?
Well, let's go back to this mysterious thing called 4E cognition.
Yeah.
And it's called 4E cognition because the 4 foundation stones, if you like, of this new emerging view, I always have new/old image of human nature, are inactive, embodied, embedded, and extended. And it's a shift in a way, it's a shift of attention from glorifying the intellect to being interested in the way we function as intelligent beings in the world, rather than starting from an academic setting. So let's take inactive. I mean, the use of the word, it's a slightly strange word. And it means a whole lot of different things, but at its simplest, it means we're built for action. We're not built for understanding or erudite conversation. Those are ancillary activities. We're built to get meaningful and important things done in the world. And that's our primary design principle, if you like. Daniel Wolpert, professor of neuroscience at Columbia University, I think now, he was at Cambridge, says we have a brain for a reason and one reason only, and that is to guide intelligent movement in the world. The brain is designed to create optimal solutions to the question, what do I do next? So it's the doing that counts. And what makes us able to act intelligently is our ability to extract patterns from our own behavior and from the world at large and use them to predict what's going to happen next. If we can predict what's going to happen in the world, we can beat the world to the draw. We can go have a snack before we're really hungry if we can act on the earlier signals of hunger. So the predictive processing model is simply basically saying we're built for anticipation. We're built to create useful models of what's going on around us so that we can intervene in interesting ways in the world. And learning is what we do when we're surprised or disappointed or confused or frustrated or shocked or discombobulated or made uncertain by what's going on around us. So learning itself is designed to be fueled by, let us just say, surprise, by what wasn't quite what we anticipated. Learning is an opportunity to update our predictions, update our models of the world, which is very different from learning is about being able to recite the kings and queens of England. It's a very different starting point, if you like. It's not to say that there aren't certain rather narrow purposes for which knowing the kings and queens of England might not be useful. It's for saying if you take a broader view of us as intelligent creatures functioning in a complex world, being able to recite the kings and queens of England would not come at the top of your list unless you want to win mastermind or impress friends at a North London dinner party. There are certain narrow spheres in which those displays of knowledge for its own sake might be useful, but much more useful are the kind of embodied patterns, the embodied knowledge that we have, which enables us to say, she looks a bit dodgy, I think he's going to be trustworthy, there's going to be enough time to cross the road before the bus comes. It's understanding ourselves at that level. It's like the hidden depths of the iceberg that we are, rather than only talking and thinking about the shiny white tip of the iceberg, which is reasoning. So it's a way of broadening our understanding of learning, the possibilities of learning, the functions of learning, of taking it out of that set of presuppositions that learning is what happens in classrooms, which is committing to memory. That's the phrase, isn't it? You commit things to memory, or you learn how to perform certain procedures. And out of that view of learning, that narrow intellectualized view of learning, comes things like repetition and spaced testing and all of those things that are quite popular in certain spheres of the world, which, if you're interested in people's performance on examinations, which examine relatively superficial abilities to recall and manipulate rather dry bodies of knowledge, then those things are important. Then they work well. Then sitting there and committing them to memory and doing. But if you're interested in what enables people to feel that they're living an adventurous, intelligent, worthwhile, moral, satisfying life when they're 50 years old, you have a very different view of learning. You have a very different view of your priorities. So we need to bring in ideas like Antonio's somatic. I like the idea of the somatic rudder. All his experiments, his neurological experiments, show that people who suffer from a certain kind of brain damage retain their intellectual intelligence, but can no longer harness that to the promptings and directions of what's meaningful, what's significant to me, which is what he calls the somatic rudder. All our memories are stored with a sense of, did that work? Was that good for me? Did it correspond to my values? And these are often present in a visceral sense of pleasure or displeasure, of approach or avoidance. And if we decouple the somatic rudder, those promptings about what's significant, what's meaningful, what's wholesome, what's worthwhile for me, from our cognition, from our ability to think carefully, then we can score 140 points on an IQ test, but we just keep messing up in our life. So that's where the somatic rudder comes in, and that's part of the embodiment and the inactive thing. The embodiment is important because our values often live, the center of our values is often down in our hearts and our tummies rather than in our brains. We feel the importance. When you're watching the evening news, you know you're not only understanding what's going on in Kiev or Gala, you're touched by it, you're moved by it. It means something to you. And if we have only a narrow cognitivized view of learning, we miss out on all of that. Where's the place for that in committing swathes of things to memory?
Yeah. Yeah, and it goes deep, this, doesn't it? The Damasio's work and this idea that not just highly charged topics like that, but just words like table or Rolex or dog or something, that everything is sort of charged with some sort of emotional tag, and that this is the emotion is so fundamental to our understanding of concepts and ideas. And so you mentioned the 4 E's model there, and I know that you talk about the E's have been multiplying, right? And you introduced what you described as an orchestra of E's, and there's a number of additional ones. You talk about that we are evaluative, we are emergent, expectant, and so on. Let's not go through all of them because time is a bit limited. But Emily, is there one that you might like to alight on a little bit to unpack an additional E to this model?
Well, again, we've already started talking about it. Also, in what Guy was just describing, I would go for emotional as an E, even though some people in 4E science, there's even 4EA as a term now, which is with the A standing for affective or emotional. And it's just understanding that all of our cognition is motivated by our emotional states. And I think that would be something I think that is extremely important to understand in a classroom for a lot of different reasons. From what is meaningful and interesting to the students would be motivating. If something has no connection to their lives or interests, it will be very hard, I think, to learn about something like that. From that direction of stuff to the emotions flying around in the classroom between students, between the teacher and a certain student, so all of those emotional, I don't know, signals, things, vibes flying around, they're part of the situation and they're important. So I think I would just encourage educators to work on, and I know a lot of them, I'm not as well versed in the world of education, obviously, as you guys are. And I know there are things like social emotional learning and all kinds of programs like that. I just think the emotional literacy, emotional intelligence is one of the most important things that an educator could work on.
Yes, I agree.
You've had Mary Helen Immordino-Yang on your podcast, and her work is particularly seminal in this context. Some of her recent work, which I'm sure she's talked about to you, is having in-depth conversations with adolescents in America, often from quite deprived or challenging backgrounds, and really kind of teasing out for them what they care about, what is important, what matters in their lives, and quite long, often 2 hours worth of an interview, and then following them up with MRI studies and so on, and discovering that those relatively brief interventions of legitimating and focusing on what has emotional significance, what matters to me, what touches me, what is of significance to me, actually stimulates brain growth. You can see the growth of these kids' brains in a way that kids who are doing well on the traditional curriculum in school may not be. So thanks to people like Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, we've got really hard data about the fact that tying what the significance. Emotions are really just telling us what's significant, what's to be desired, what's to be frightened of, what's to be disgusted by, is what our emotions are for. Sometimes through enculturation, our emotions give us mixed messages or even wrong messages. They're not always infallible, but without them, we're much worse off than we are with them. So it's just really looking at the evidence, which says you can't talk. Mary Helen says you can't talk sense about learning without incorporating emotion, which is exactly what Emily was just saying.
Yeah, we feel, therefore we learn. And so can I just ask a quick follow-up on that? So you mentioned it's really heartbreaking when you think about that we care, like when we care about something, when we're asked about ourselves, that it activates brain growth. And I've been really influenced in my life by a guy called Ian Cunningham, who talks about P mode and S mode learning. And P mode is like people and the problems that they face and their processes of learning, their preferences for what they want to learn about and so on. And then S mode is like subjects and specialisms and skills and what have you, and things that you need to learn about, sciences. And what he says is that you need both of them. But what you really want to do is start with P and then go to S, right? So who are you as a person? What's going on for you? What are you interested in? Where do you see your life going? What's important to you? And then let's go and find the S's that will meet you there.
Yes.
And the school system does not do that, does it? It starts with S and just basically stays there. And it's like this broadcast mechanism. It's just like you're going to learn about all of this S stuff, whether you like it or not, whether you care about it or not. And there's quite a powerful line in the book relating back to Damasio's somatic rubber. rudder, rather, not rubber. That's a whole separate thing. You speculate that 12 years in a school culture that systematically neglects the body, that neglects the person, if you like, can produce a low-grade version of the brain damage suffered by his patients. Which is obviously very strong language. But what are your feelings on that? Would you stand up that statement?
It is strong. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but it kind of calls into relief the things we've been talking about. I tried that idea out. The fact that Vygotsky a long time ago said you pick up your mind from the people you hang out with. In other words, the nature, not just what we know, but how we know, how we think, how we learn, it's constituted by habits. There's good scientific reason for this view now. Constituted by habits that we've picked up from the cultures that we have inhabited. I've forgotten where I was going with that.
Well, my mum used to say that. I'd just like to throw in there that my mum used to say that, if you fly with the crows, you'll get shot with the crows.
Yeah.
So you know that.
Yeah. Exactly. What was I talking about?
I think you were going to go back to trying out the idea of the brain damage.
Oh, yeah.
On Mary Helen Embodiment. Because I think, didn't you email her about that?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I did. I tried her out on that idea. The habits that we pick up. School is an immersive environment, so it's not surprising that the habits that are routinely required in school are the ones that students either adopt or they rebel against, and the ones that are never talked about or never mentioned are things that remain latent or may not appear. So it just struck me as an interesting thought that look at school in terms of that. What is the culture that you're being immersed in? And if it is a culture that continually, almost exclusively, privileges the disembodied, the disengaged, the disinterested, the theoretical, the abstract, the material that lacks personal meaning, that has an effect on the way your brain is wired. If it effectively, you could argue that it's an apprenticeship in dissociating your emotional life from your cognitive life, which is what I meant by that challenging comment. Right. You could see it's a provocation. I'm not asserting it as a cut and dried fact, but I think it's a worthwhile provocation, saying, could it be that school has that cumulative effect, at least on some of the young people that emerge from school? Maybe not from all. Maybe some people are more immune to this contagion. But certainly when you look around at the people who govern us or run our large companies, you can see a lot of people who are very clever but not very intelligent. And it's like learning to make that distinction again, I think, is quite important. Em, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just have to bring in something, because when we're saying disembodied, disengage, that's also a specific way of being embodied. We're embodied all the time. Like, I think it's important. It's a tricky language thing, but I think what summarizes it is a certain way of being or being embodied that is dissociating my felt experience from my intellectual thinking. Like, I think it's important to say that at school we're training a very specific, or let's say traditional school, we're training a very specific way of being embodied in the world. It's still embodied. It's just separate that we're training those separations between feelings and thinking, rather than bringing them more together in terms of what's maybe motivating that person internally, right? So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Absolutely, quite right.
You have an interesting section on this, the idea of the wordscape and the lifescape, and two planes of knowledge in the body mind. And to me, that felt like one of the book's original contributions, one of many. Can you unpack that for our listeners, that concept?
It's a tool for thinking. It's not, the brain is clearly doesn't exist as two separate planes, but it's a way of having that we have found useful for thinking about certain things. So if you imagine, we have a diagram of the book of two planes, one of which lies on top of the other, and the lower plane is what we call the lifescape, which is this undulating, dynamic, statistical residue, the sediment of our learning and our experience, all those expectations and anticipations and predictions and somatic markers that guide us through life, often accurately and positively, sometimes misguidedly, that guide us through life. And then as we learn language, we start to build another plane, the wordscape, if you like, which first of all is strongly connected with the lifescape. Look over there, that's Fido. Fido's a dog. So you already have an embodied conception of Fido. You know what she looks like and smells like and yaps like and what she likes to eat and all of those kinds of things. But now you have a different way. It's as if the little sort of molehill of expertise that represents Fido in your brain now has a flag planted in it, which says there's another way of getting to Fido, which is through the word Fido, or the written word Fido. So and then the wordscape begins to develop its own connections and begins to become semi-detached from the lifescape. But there's always those, like I earlier used the idea of Jack and the Beanstalk, there's always those undergrowth of these stalks that connect the wordscape to the lifescape partially. But the wordscape also begins to develop a life of its own in which you can devise concepts like unicorns, for example, that don't exist in the wild, but which you can construct in the wordscape and then, as it were, project down. You know, it's a bit like a horse, like a cross between a horse and a rhinoceros and da-da-de-da, the way it works. And this tool for thinking helps us think a little bit about the relationship, about the need, the way in which the wordscape, which has been the kind of natural habitat for traditional education, the way that wordscape is inevitably, partially, but always functionally connected with this substrate of our life experience. That's enough to give you an idea about that. You know, it's not a cut and dried, it's not a powerful psychological theory, although it could be developed into one. But it is, as I say, part of what we're doing in the book is trying to give people tools for thinking, which enable them to think in a more body-minded kind of way, rather than a body versus mind kind of way.
You have an interesting argument as well that the memory isn't a storehouse or a hard drive, but something more like a living landscape, and that seems to tie into that section that you've just gone through, and that it's shaped by experience. In practical terms, what does that mean? Does it change how we should think about, for example, retrieval practice or spaced learning or any of these currently fashionable ideas that get bandied about?
I mean, this is thinking about memory is another example of how we attempt to get a handle on things that are strange or complicated. This is what science does all the time, by reaching for an analogy, saying, well, it's a bit like this, that, or the other. So Plato, right from the start of Plato was saying, well, memory is a bit like a wax tablet on which we inscribe our experience. And some people's wax is too hard and other people's wax is too soft. Or it's a bit like an aviary with birds flying around in different compartments. And then some other people said, memory is like a telephone exchange. And then with the advent of the digital computer, Memory said, oh no, memory is a bit like a computer. It has a hard drive, which we're going to call long-term memory, which is where knowledge is stored. And then it has a narrow throat, a kind of gangway that information gets into long-term memory through something called working memory, which is a narrow bottleneck. And information, data, items, that language of memory as consisting of items or data derives from that computational metaphor, but it is only a metaphor. The idea that memory is a bit like a warehouse, a bit like a library, a bit like a store, is a metaphor. And towards the end of the last millennium, around the 1980s, 1990s, that metaphor was already being called into question. But we can see in some of the regressive approaches to education around at the moment what a powerful effect that metaphor has had on people's thinking about education. You know, if what you have is a storehouse, then obviously the job of education is to transfer stuff from the outside into the inside. You're shipping in facts and information. So that metaphor seems to give scientific credibility to a particular model, a transmission model of teaching and learning. But it's not correct, it's not true. In a way, it's a useful device for legitimating a particular approach to teaching and learning. If you start from an embodied standpoint, something more like the lifescape, which we've just been talking about, then you have a very different view of memory as being something that is much more embodied, much more fluid, much more connected with action, much more about perception and the way you frame the world and the network of anticipations that constitute our conscious model of the world. You're led in a very different direction by a different metaphor. Memory as biological matter rather than memory as a warehouse leads you in very different directions. So, and some people still haven't got that idea. They think memory is a storehouse. No, memory from some purposes can be seen as or is a bit like, but we have other options which are particularly the biogenic, biological metaphors or options. What Donald Hebb, the father of this work, calls the conceptual nervous system modeling, which leads us in a different direction, leads us in a direction of a much more grounded, a much more experiential, a much more embodied way of thinking about what we're up to in schools.
I love that idea of the directive power as the metaphor, and that we don't talk enough about the potency of the metaphor in shaping thinking. And if a metaphor sounds reasonable,
yes,
then it overrides science in many, many instances.
Yes,
and you've given so many good examples of it in that last section.
It's one of the things we should be doing in school, I think, which is training kids in the power and pitfalls of metaphorical thinking. Somebody said, I think it was Samuel Johnson said, metaphors are very misleading. Unfortunately, they're the least misleading thing we have. And it's like, you know, scientists all the time, and even mathematicians, get together over coffee when they're talking about a new phenomenon. And what they do is trade concrete metaphors and analogies. Well, what would it look like if we treated the heart as if it was a bit like a pump? Well, that one's turned out to work quite well. What if we treated the atom as if it was a bit like a miniature solar system? Well, that worked all right for a while, and now we've moved on to a different set of metaphors. So learning to think with metaphors, but also learning to critique your metaphors so you don't get trapped by them, are fundamental life skills, you might say, fundamental instruments in the real world intelligence orchestra, which we should be teaching kids at school. There should be a lot of talk about it's a bit like this, but not completely like this. Where does that metaphor help, and where does it begin to hinder us? That's a very powerful form of embodied thinking, isn't it?
Let's rethink education.
Hello everybody, I will keep this short and sweet, so no need to reach for that skip button. We love making this podcast, and with over 600,000 episodes downloaded to date, it seems like people out there are enjoying it too. In fact, we even hear from people from time to time. It is a labour of love though, with the emphasis on both the love and the labour. Producing each episode involves reading books, carrying out the interviews, obviously editing them, paying for the increasingly bewildering array of tools that keep a show like this running. Most people don't realize, but podcasts like this rely on support from people like yourselves. Right now, we have 27 patrons who help us to keep this show going. If just 1% of our listeners joined them at patreon.com/repod, we could sustainably create even more of these amazing conversations, which I think are increasingly urgent. There are various tiers to choose from with different benefits attached to each tier, starting from as little as the price of a cup of coffee or herbal tea per month. Or if you prefer to make a one-off donation, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/repod. Either way, if you just want to carry on listening, please feel free to do so. And thank you very much for being part of this community. Now let's get back to today's episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, this whole idea of how we need to wrestle with the concept of truth and the decline of the concept of truth, and that whole discussion around that about the critique of the metaphor, the critique of the analogy, all of these things I think are really powerful. We don't talk about it enough. So thank you for that. Really helpful contribution.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so the chapter on reasoning, I'll come over to you, Emily. I'd like to come on to your work, to the work that you do in workplaces, and just to frame it a little bit, if I may. The chapter on reasoning is quite provocative, and as we've already heard, right? The guy's already alluded to this a couple of times, arguing that what schools treat as the sort of the highest faculty of mind, like rational deliberation, is perhaps overrated, and even and I think you described it as an apprenticeship in sophistry. And a brief survey of our political class from recent years suggests that you may be onto something here, right? There are, as Guy says, there are people who are good at passing tests. Exhibit A might be Liz Truss, right? Who got did quite well at Oxford University, right? She did very, very well, but arguably was, not the most gifted prime minister that we've ever had. And so I'm interested in what an alternative to this might look like. And I'm really interested to hear more about the work that you do in workplaces, working with adults on helping them to become more embodied in the way that they go about their work. And I'm interested in that practice, but also to hear about, you said a few moments ago that it's been harder to do this than you sort of anticipated when you started doing it. So I'd really love to hear about that.
Okay. Let's see if I can weave some of the things together.
Okay.
Because I think we were talking a lot about the habits that we form when we're at school, and these 12 years or 15,000 hours of what we've been practicing. Well, I think those habits then they start to run us. Then that whatever the habits then just start running. And I think what we met in these workplaces were a lot of these certain habits, many of them that were probably coming from school. And for instance, I remember early on, we did a workshop where we were looking at, your computer position or the posture that you take at the computer. And we sent the people back to their desk to research their position and the mood that they're in and all these things. At least a third of them did not come back to the workshop because they were back in work mode and kept working. And so I think that was very telling for me. It was like, okay, work mode is strong.
Right.
In the past, I had people coming to me for workshops. It was their own interest, their own volition. Now I'm in the workplace and not all of them maybe chose to be there, but they're interested enough to come. But so again, there are these issues of motivation and kind of what's interesting for people and the strength of the habits of work mode, right? And so I think those same rules or principles apply even to someone who's in a leadership position or who has been trained to lead in a certain way. And I think the way often has been a lot about performance and functioning and optimizing and getting the right results, the same as the test driven model. So again, just meeting it in other contexts in the world, right? And what we're noticing though is now more and more what's very necessary and needed is some kind of relational competence. Otherwise you're going to be alone in the end at the top, which many people are, and I think even many school leaders are. And so I think now I'm jumping, but I James was looking a bit at your work in these slice groups and that people are working together, and I think that's a what's the word I'm looking for? It counteracts those old habits and gives a very different kind of approach to leadership and collaboration and meaningful change. So I think that's absolutely the direction that I think everything needs to go, and that we can start practicing those things way earlier, and that we need to. I don't know if that completely answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. It's very, very interesting. And so I'd like to throw a bit of a curveball in, I guess, here. There's something that occurred to me as I was writing these questions this morning. At one point in the book, I don't know whether either of you might want to pick this one up. You write about how like conscious thought and intention, often we tell ourselves that we're thinking rationally, but actually they're sort of like post hoc rationalizations of what has already been decided pre-consciously or by our guts, if you like, by our instincts. And Jonathan Haidt has written about this in his book The Righteous Mind, uses the metaphor of the elephant and the rider, that our guts or our sort of emotional life, our sort of gut instinct is the elephant and we're the rider, and we think we're steering it, but actually that elephant's going where it wants to anyway. And we can see this playing out in any number of sort of polarized debates that we see, where people are sort of like impervious to rational persuasion, right? You can show people a graph that shows that, you know, unvaccinated people don't have as good outcomes as people who are vaccinated, for example. But people who are really convinced that vaccinations are like somehow evil are not going to be persuaded by that graph. It's like they've decided on some other level, and you can see this in the way that people vote or all kinds of different ways. But is this in some cases like something to be, you know, is this like a denial of the idea of like a mind body taking a more cohesive approach, that actually sometimes our guts are wrong about things, and actually it's good to think things through? Is this something to be cautious about? I don't know if I've phrased that very well, but do you know what I'm driving at?
I think so. And I think I would, again, you mentioned it before, this two-way street. And I think this kind of body-mind learning or literacy that we're going for in the book is about understanding what's underneath the surface of the iceberg and understanding what's maybe in my more rational conscious thinking, but in being able to be aware of the fact that, ooh, I'm in a defensive reaction right now, and I don't care what you say, but you're not going to convince me otherwise. I think that the key piece in there is self-awareness and being honest, or noticing, I'm in actually a reactionary, more defensive mode right now, versus, I'm in actually a more open, listening, willing to question mode right now. And this is for me where the embodied awareness becomes crucial, is that I know where I am when, and I'm very often in defense mode, and no one can convince me if I'm hangry and tired, but at least I know it, and at least I know then, okay, maybe I need to go back and correct that, or I need to revisit and learn something else. So I think what I'm pointing to on this point is awareness of the rider and the elephant, and knowing how they interact and understanding that better. Even if I meet another person who's maybe in defense mode, then I can notice that too and say, okay, maybe now is not the moment where we're going to have the best exchange, and I can exit and not invest energy there. But this is, again, this awareness, self-awareness, outside other awareness, and how can I move more agilely in different contexts. Like for me, the awareness is the key piece there, of the awareness of what's going on and maybe a deeper understanding of what's going on. And I think that could and should be part of school.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so this next one is I think they're going to be directed at Guy, and then I'll pass back over to David. And so there's a box in this chapter which is about all of the possibilities that Joe might not be learning X easily, ranging from the fact that Joe is hungry to the fact that they may be fearing a bully at break time, or there's some social drama going on in their life. There are lots of reasons why something might not be working for Joe in this particular lesson, and this is sort of linked to cognitive load theory. You write about this on the same page of the book, about cognitive load theory, which you describe as stemming from, and again, a provocative quote here, a shrunken, cold cognition view of children's minds and memories. So over to you, Guy, with this one. Why do you think it is that cognitive load theory gets such a good press, and not such a good press, but just as seems to have really taken root in recent years, when the picture is so much more complicated than cognitive load theory would allow?
Well, it fits with the computer model of the mind, doesn't it? It's the whole idea of cognitive load stems from this idea of working memory and a narrow channel that you have to squeeze things through, and that you can't make things too difficult, or things get bunged up in the channel. So everything is seen. Once you have that metaphor in your mind, it begins to shape the way you think about children. It shapes what you see about them and what you don't see about them. And it's a very simple way of looking at children. I mean, the question that cognitive load theory is designed to answer is, why do some children find learning some things difficult? And there are dozens and dozens of possible answers to that, some of which you've already alluded to, which we talk about in the book. But a lot of them involve feelings or interactions, involve the stuff that don't fit into the boxy computer-based model of the mind. So if you're looking through a lens which only picks out those kind of attributes, then you will automatically start to think that if kids are having difficulty learning this, it may be because we're overloading their cognitive load or something like that. And it may be, but it's like cognitive load is one amongst, let us say, 17 possible reasons why this child in this situation, in this lesson, is struggling to understand something. It may be that she dislikes you, the teacher, and she's doing whatever she can to frustrate you. It may be that by appearing to be struggling with the difficulty of this, she's getting kudos from a group of kids that she wants to be liked by. It may be that she's worried that her mum and dad are splitting up. It may be there's all kinds of things that it might be which don't fit with that narrow information processing view of the mind. So I just think it's useful. It's not that cognitive load theory is wrong. It's just that it's an extremely narrow and distorting lens through which to look at children.
I'm interested in the way we've gone into, almost the practical context, talking about why a child's not learning, a specific child is not learning at a particular time and in a particular context. And that led me into the chapter 9 of the book, which is about the proof of concept schools, I think, as you describe them. So there are clearly schools that are already doing work that sits with the embodied science and sits with lots of the ideas that you're describing, but we haven't scaled them. You get a remarkable testimonial from Francis Holland, a former head, about talking about children becoming braver, their self-esteem growing, and so did their grades after that character-led curriculum shift. So why hasn't that spread further? I mean, you've tackled this a bit in some of the earlier conversations, Guy, and you tackle it in some of the earlier chapters. But why haven't we got the scaling up for these approaches?
I think, shall I have a quick go at that? Then maybe Emily would like to come into it. I think it's partly because where the embodied model leads us. Let me take one step back from this. Quite a lot of the attempts to extract educational implications from the study of embodied cognition revolve around small adjustments to what's going on in classrooms, which make the learning of traditional concepts easier or more efficient. Our reading of the implications of embodiment are just as much that they open up our thinking about the purposes of education and not only about the practicalities of education as it is. Once you start thinking and talking about, for example, predictive processing, the learned habits that are embedded in the way people function, which determine the way they go about learning, which is what we call learning dispositions, behaviorally embedded learning dispositions. Once you start recognizing the importance of those kinds of things, it's a very obvious next step to say, shouldn't the cultivation of these positive learning dispositions be part of the purpose of our schooling? Not just so that kids do better on the tests or remember Pythagoras' theorem more reliably, but actually there are a whole lot of other positive outcomes that are valuable in their own right, which we could be paying more attention to. Like, for example, the work of James Heckman and others, Nobel Prize-winning economists, showing that the predictors of life satisfaction, of the success of life when you're 45 or 50 years old, are not your exam results, they're your resilience, your tolerance for uncertainty, your imagination, your empathy, your collaborativeness, the things that have all been around in psychology for a long time, called the big five characteristics of personality, that those things are malleable. And if they're malleable, why the hell are we not malling them in school? If these are more powerful predictors of people leading a happy, successful, adventurous, responsible, loving, choose your own adjectives, life for the rest of their life course, if they have got to the point, as someone said to me, startled me a long time ago, by saying, I think the function of education is to prepare people who will be able to die without regret. Now, how's that for an ambition? How's that for a long horizon of what we're up to, rather than the short horizon of university entrance that seems to have kind of mesmerized people in education for quite a lot? So if that's a possibility of what we call in the book epistemic apprenticeship, deliberately designing activities and challenges which stretch and strengthen young people's ability progressively to handle complex challenges and problems with competence, with sophistication, with confidence. Why on earth are we not doing that? Because sure as eggs are eggs, the traditional curriculum does not, there's lots of research on this, does not transfer into high quality real world thinkers and learners. Yeah. Let me say that again. The tradition, being successful on the traditional curriculum, develops a narrow set of mental competencies which do not translate into your ability to think carefully about whether to leave the European Union or not. You can have a first from Oxford and be pretty stupid when confronted with those things. That transfer doesn't automatically happen. So if we want people who have those general purpose, powerful, positive set of dispositions which enable them to be, for the school that I was working in last week, has as its main objective to help to produce kids who are a force for good in the world. If that's an admirable objective, and if, as the science now suggests, it's an achievable objective, why the hell are we not embedding that more and more? Why are we not rethinking our curriculum and our pedagogy in such a way that they're designed to optimize the growth of those characteristics?
Yeah.
So for us, the ramifications of embodiment science run much deeper and are much more interesting and much more challenging than simply helping people understand ratio a little bit better.
Oh, sorry, Emily, I muted you. Don't worry, we'll fix it in the edit. I'll unmute. There you go.
Oh, what I just wanted to say is that's why I think that testimonial from Lucy Elphinstone is so beautiful, and it arrived as an email while we were working on the book, and I think she had read or her decision to start the character curriculum that she then followed for the last 10 or 11 years of her career came from, I think, from Guy, your book with Bill, Educating Ruby. I think that was where it came from.
Yes.
And so she writes Guy out of the blue 10 years later to say, I had the most rewarding 10 years of my career, and the children became braver, their self-esteem grew, and so did their grades after this character curriculum shift. And it was such an interesting thing for the world to throw back in that moment. And I think these learning dispositions in the character curriculum are these embodied habits that we're talking about, of being more empathetic or of being more persistent or collaborative or whatever the dispositions are that we want to focus on. That's, I think, why I was just astonished that that testimonial arrived in that moment.
Yes,
that it exemplifies. Yeah.
If we're talking about proofs of concept, there are dozens of which Francis Holland's school is perhaps one of the most shining examples of the fact that if you invest more time, more energy, more teacher expertise in helping kids, what I sometimes call fit the turbocharger to their learning capacity, then they do better even on school stuff. They're better prepared for university, they're better prepared for life. Oh, and by the way, they also do better on the tests. There are those around you who will try and convince you otherwise, try and convince you that any attempt to develop learning skills or learning capacity runs counter to them acquiring the knowledge required to do well on their examinations. This belief, it all depends on the quality and the nature of your teaching. If you're teaching in an old-fashioned way, then that may well be true. Then attempt to develop learning skills might interfere with the transmission of that information. But if you do it well, if you see it that this is operating not like a tug of war, but as something that's operating on a different level in the classroom, and I know James's research work for his PhD and other things speak volumes in this context. If you pay attention, even a small amount of attention, to building those capacities, then why wouldn't kids learn what they need to learn to do well on the tests more efficiently, more elegantly, more deeply, and more productively? Of course they do. So there are a number of these myths which I addressed in an earlier book called The Future of Teaching and the Myths That Hold It Back, which rear their heads again in the context of embodiment.
And again, we talked earlier about this being an English, this is quite an English conversation in some sense, that these things are happening in lots of schools around the world. And towards the end of the book, there's a big list of them. And you're right, Emily, that it's a lot of it just comes down to habits. Like, people are creatures of habit, aren't they? That we behave, people just do more or less the same stuff at the same time in the same place most days. And in schools, even more so, because, they're such regimented places. And therefore, habit change is the thing that we need to be focusing on. And that's really hard, like changing your habits. Even if it's yourself and you're wanting to change your habits, you want to eat less donuts in meetings, or if you want to, read more poetry or do whatever it is, it's hard to maintain those changes for the long term. And if you're talking about something as complex as a school and trying to change the habits of people in that school, adults and children, and lots of what we're going to come onto in this final part of this conversation, I think applies just as much to adults as it does to young people. It's really hard, but it's absolutely doable. And looking at it through that habit lens is very powerful. Which brings us, I think, neatly into chapter 10, which is the 87 things to try chapter. And congratulations, first of all. It's a very impressive list. It's an exhaustive list. You can see that you dug deep there, and you acknowledge that some of these things are strongly rooted in evidence. Some of them are perhaps a bit more tentative, and some of them sort of draw on your previous work, Guy, and some of the stuff around being more learner centered and so on. It feels to me like this is almost like an initial long list, and it feels like there's a bit of work to do here to develop these ideas and to create like a toolkit for teachers and other educators. And so these 87 things are grouped into different themes. There's like stuff around increasing body awareness, thinking with our bodies, using our bodies to manipulate objects to help us thinking about the physical space, play and imagination and so on. And so obviously 87 is a lot. I wonder if I could ask each of you to just pick out your favorites, 1, 2, or 3, something that you think that would be interesting for people to hear about. And this could be either addressed at young people or at adults.
Well, before I tell you some top favorites,
okay.
For sure, 87 is a lot. And I think Guy and I, it was especially important to me, I think to both of us, but that there are practical bridges into the practical. Like, we have this amazing theoretical landscape going on, and how does that come into the day-to-day?
Yeah.
Again and again and again. And I think with these 87 things, I think if you read through all of them, it will do something to you. like it will have an effect. And many of them are similar, but they're coming from a different angle. And I think what was important for me to show was that all of these, I think there are 10 key elements, or 10 groupings actually, and you can enter from any one of them according to where you are, and try something like that is based on this science landscape that we've created. And so again, that some of them might sound similar or even be slightly repetitive, but the idea is to just have a buffet of things that kind of gets you in a certain mode of thinking and trying and reflecting. So that's just, I wanted to say that about the 87 things, because it is a lot of things for sure.
Okay, so do you have a favorite one, or maybe a couple that you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, my default favorite will always be movement. I think we need to move much more than we do, and that can be easier than we often think. It could be as simple as kids standing up and lining up 2 by 2 and having a lightning discussion about a topic before the class then discusses it. Or it could be walks and talks, or even there's a great program called Math and Movement in the US, and they use the stairs in the school to work on math concepts, or the hallways, or so it's a mix of moving in space and learning math. They have a lot of mats on the floor where you learn different, addition, subtraction kind of stuff, but it's not just this sitting learning thing. So the movement section for me is especially close to my heart. And also because I think there is an amazing thing to understand about movement and thinking, that it's not, what if it's not a break from learning? Because movement breaks have become very normal, I think, now in a lot of classrooms. but what if movement is actually a preparation for learning? Or what if movement is part of the learning itself? And now maybe an extension of that idea is maybe I'm acting out the Doppler effect in the room, and it helps me understand it because I understand how the particles are moving in space, and it will give me a different experience of that concept if I'm learning it in an active way, let's say. So one of my favorites is also came from Guy of this reenacting a historical scene from the emotional perspectives of different players in the scene. I think the example was in World War II, the mother of German soldiers, or a medic, or a general in the army, and which emotional perspective would they have? You start to see the situation differently and understand it differently from those different perspectives, for instance.
Yeah, thank you. I love it. How about you, Guy? Do you have a favorite from this section, in this chapter?
What popped into my mind was an exercise that I've done quite a lot, which it doesn't, like a lot of these exercises, they don't always work for everybody, but this one works quite well, is to do a room full of teachers on an inset day and get them to do a little guided meditation. Close their eyes, 3 deep breaths, relax into your body. Now see if you can conjure up in your mind's eye a school room, a classroom that you sat in when you were 8, or it could be 13, doesn't matter. And see how vividly you can recreate that scene for yourself. Where are you sitting in the room? Where are the windows? What's the quality of the light? Is there a smell in the room? Who else is in the room? Who are you sitting next to? Can you remember their name? Who's the teacher who's at the front of the room? Do you like the teacher or dislike them? Do you feel safe with them or unsafe? What's going on in your body when you put a teacher who you like at the front of the room? Now put a different teacher, someone who you were scared of, or who didn't understand you, or who'd been mean to you. Put them at the front of the room. Now what's happening inside your body? And it's often surprisingly vivid. People could remember the name of the person they sat next to, who they haven't thought of for 50 years, maybe. But it's a way of using imagination to get people into a very embodied sense of what it was like, and in a way, this wouldn't be my preferred way of putting it, but to kind of tenderize them or humanize them to what's going on in their classrooms all the time and every day, the kind of embodied presences, dynamics that are constantly going on behind the scenes in their classrooms. I've always liked that as an exercise.
Yeah, love it. Thank you. I'm gonna share my favorite one, which is one that I hadn't come across before, and I don't know if I get the pronunciation of this right. Is it the Numenmar image? Is that right?
Yeah.
Numenmar. I hope it's not copyrighted. I'll show the thing here, so I don't know if people can see if anyone's watching this. So it's like little sort of body heat map diagrams associated with different. The connection between body sensations and emotions, like anger, fear, disgust, happiness, depression, and so on. And of course, it's not like a cut and dried thing. And the activity is to ask kids to color in their own personal versions and to compare it with each other and to discuss that. And I think it looks like I really want to do that when I next get the opportunity. It looks like a really powerful way to just start to get people to develop that interoceptive sense of how their bodies are telling them things, whether they sort of noticing that or not. I really like that one. I don't know if you have a favorite, David, or if perhaps we should move into the broader implications to wrap up.
Let's do that. I think conscious of time, but I mean, I guess what do you hope will happen if schools really get on board with this agenda on a wider scale? We've talked about grades improving. Will we have fewer young people not in education, employment or training? Will we achieve some of the targets that Alan Milburn is likely to set for young people in England? Will attendance improve? will young people be more employable? What about mental health? What do you see as being the outcomes that we might look for if we get some scaling up of the ideas you're putting forward in the book?
We have a standoff. Who'd like to pick that one up?
Well, I would like to think that all of those things you just mentioned could be fairly predictable results. And I think we are dealing with humans, and so and I think we're trying to scale a very human-centered kind of thing that is maybe difficult to measure, but I do think that those types of outcomes would be the result of a more embodied approach to education. I think you would have less absenteeism. I think mental health would improve in both teachers and students. Again, this literacy thing, if we're understanding emotional health better, if we're moving more, if we're having a safer relational environments that we're learning in, if we're practicing being more resilient in different ways, I think that would lead to all of those kinds of outcomes. And I think if learning is made more meaningful and relevant to students, they would want to go to school more. And I think those are kind of simple truths. Guy, please add.
Yeah, well, I don't have much to add. I think it's back to this idea that embodiment science, when you look at it in this sort of broad way, look at it as strongly suggesting a revised way of thinking about the purpose of education. Science never tells you what you have to do, but it can tell you what you might do, what might be wantable in education, what might be feasible. And I think what embodiment science has strengthened, crystallized for me, is the idea that it's worth wanting an education which deliberately, for all youngsters, I think this is the important thing. At the moment, education in many jurisdictions is still a matter of a kind of a competition. It's an obstacle race. It's a kind of what I call intellectual selectionism. Gradually stuff gets intellectually harder, and at the end the winners are the people who get to Oxford or Stanford or whatever it might be. And a third of young people leave school with nothing much that's worth trading, that doesn't have much cash value in the big wide world. I think that's scandalous. I think the idea that somehow traditional schools are the way they're meant to be, and it's just an unfortunate fact that a third of them aren't bright enough to have been successful, is a real lie. It's really fake news. Schools are built around this selective principle. To be a success in school is to require that there are other kids who weren't successful in school. It's that kind of narrow funnel. So in any humane society, there has to be another way of thinking about school and the purpose of school and the desirable outcomes of school, which are available for everybody, whether they're going to become a neuroscientist or a hairdresser or a shepherdess or a short order chef or a stay-at-home dad or whatever they're going to be. They'll be grateful for having been helped to build their empathy, their confidence, their communication skills, their oracy, their ability to persevere in the face of difficulty, their tolerance for diversity. The list is not very sophisticated. It's broadly agreed the world over. So if we can change those purposes, then yes, if school can be an escalating series of meaningful challenges or projects, meaningful and irresistible, in which in the course of engaging with those activities, they are necessarily required to become more resilient, better researchers, better collaborators, more willing to be critical of their own drafts and to know how to improve them, and escalate a series of such activities which escalate in their complexity, their autonomy, their individual responsibility, their reliance on disciplinary knowledge, if we built a school system around that, then everybody would want to go.
And the good news is that we've just done one of these podcasts with Liz Robinson and Sarah, sorry, I'm going to mispronounce her second name.
Selesnyov.
Thank you very much indeed. That's why we need two people. We need to tag team this, who are involved with big education and schools that work on the head, hand and heart. And what we were getting back from them was a sense of exactly what you're describing. They didn't actually use the phrase that their graduates will die without regret, but I think it would be in there somewhere. So it was a really encouraging link between that much more direct conversation with people working in schools and colleagues like yourself that really helped to vindicate both. So thank you very much for that.
Yes. Yeah, and of course there is a lot of overlap with this, the big education model of head, heart, and hand. Of course, heart and hand being of the body below the neck. And they talk about a number of schools in their network. Children, wearing trainers and tracksuits at school instead of having to wear like itchy trousers and shoes, which no child would choose to do if they were given the choice. There are schools that run a print shop. There's a fantastic school that runs a print shop. They have a 60-year plan for their school. I love it, to turn around like attitudes in the families and the community that they serve. And they run a print workshop, and the kids work in this thing, and they take commercial orders and deal with customers and what have you. They run a small holding farm. They have Opal, the outdoor play and learning stuff going on at lunchtime. And there are many other synergies and initiatives that you allude to in the book where this is already taking root. Just a final sort of comment on this. There's like, I suppose there are some people, naming no names, perhaps some of these strong adherents of cognitive load theory and the likes, who might dismiss this book and this sort of work as a return to what they describe as like discredited ideas like brain gym, which was around not so long ago. You were mentioning sort of movement breaks earlier, Emily, which is sort of, I think most people would say, oh yeah, just like take a movement break. But brain gym sort of went a lot further and made some quite outlandish claims. I think it's fair to describe some of that as pseudoscientific. And like kinesthetic learning styles that we need to get children out of their seats and what have you. Or perhaps they just see it as a distraction from a school's core purpose, which, under our existing accountability measures is very much a head focused thing. It's like they need to be able to sit in that gym and sit still for 3 hours and pass exams. And that's what we're being tested on. And so that's what we're going to train them for. How would you preempt this criticism? Hasn't come to you yet, but it's in the little trad that lives eternally rent free in my head is piping up now. How might you preempt this discussion? What sort of counter arguments might you offer to such a critic?
Well, I think some of the things you mentioned were early shots in the right direction that were overhyped and over-commercialized, that didn't have a strong, respectable, rigorous scientific underpinning. I think what we're trying to provide, the piece of the jigsaw puzzle that we're trying to offer with this book, is a strong, credible, grown-up, cohering rationale for a range of these different things. So yes, having a movement break, there's nothing wrong with it, but there's no need to indulge in some kind of pseudo neurologizing, saying that your corpus callosum will grow bigger if you learn how to pat your head and rub your tummy in opposite directions at the same time. You don't need to do that. You don't need to insist that people drink water all the time or their brains will dry up. It's not true. And a lovely little study at the University of Bristol showed that if you make people drink water when they're not hungry, their cognitive performance declines. Not surprisingly. If you're thirsty and you drink water, your cognitive performance gets better. Well, who knew? So it's like early in the foothills of this endeavor, people were making some strong claims, to exaggerating, using pseudoscience. But now we know better. I think they were faltering steps in the right direction. And school's core purpose, which is to get people to pass exams. Exams aren't going to go away anytime soon. But remember Francis Holland School in Sloane Square in London. Remember Lucy Elphinstone. If you devote your energy intelligently, if you do it in a way that gets your staff on side to helping to teach in a way that builds these pro-social and epistemic aspects of character, don't worry about the results. They will go up. They won't decline. This isn't a tug of war. It's mutually supportive. It's fitting the turbocharger. The car will go faster even where it has to go as well as where it wants to go. So trust in that and start your small experiments. This is what we're advocating is radical in the sense that there is behind it quite a specific and I think pretty new model of the purposes of education. But it's also realistic in the sense that I have a rather romantic image of stepping stones across a river on a moonlit night. If the moon is shining brightly, if you have the long-term goal of a revised education that is generally empowering for all, then you will be able to see more clearly what the next stepping stone is. So I don't think there's any fundamental tension between being what the German Greens used to call a Realo or a Fundi. I think we need to be Fundis, fundamentalists, radicals in our conception of where we're heading, have a really strong, clear sense of where magnetic north is, and then to be able to translate that, which is what our chapter 10 does, into little steps which are not just random, not just piecemeal, but we can see very clearly how those are little steps from today to tomorrow to the day after tomorrow to changing the underlying system of assumptions and values about what these kids are here for in such a way that will recruit their energies and deal to a very significant extent with the problems of disruption or some of the stresses of mental health in school. I really believe that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Oh, hang on. Sorry, David. Go on.
Guy, that was masterly. You not only gave us a summary, you gave us a real rallying call. And I cannot think on a better note on which to end the conversation than that. You touched on so many of the things that we planned to ask about, and you managed to do that within the time scale that we'd set ourselves for the conversation. But I think the main thing that you've both done today is you've inspired us with the knowledge and the really strong basis that we have for moving forward in a progressive direction, not as some airy-fairy romantic adventure, but as a genuine, well underpinned approach to helping people to be better and to make the world a better place. And the phrase that will ring with me throughout, and to die without regret. Thank you so much for that.
Yes, yes, and I would like to just echo that. Thank you for that. Yeah, there was a lovely rallying cry to wrap up on. I think Emily's just dropped out. I'm not sure if that's a temporary thing. Where hopefully she'll come back to say goodbye. But yeah, thank you, Guy, for your time today. Thank you for writing this wonderful book, and it is, like I say, it's such an interesting read. Really got me thinking, as I say, about the mind-body split in my own life, and about how this plays out in schools. And there's a diagnosis and prescription thing here, and the diagnosis and the setting out of the building the case for understanding this, laying out the science, pointing out the hierarchy of subjects. It's like it's incontrovertible that there is this mind-body split, that we have this disembodied view of this very narrow disembodied view of what an education is. And is that the phone going?
No,
your one, David?
No, this is Sorry, I've just got a message from Emily, so this might explain where she's gone to.
Oh,
no, wait a minute. Trying to reconnect now, she says. My computer just died. Hold on.
Oh, okay. Well, should we just take 1 minute? I think we're going to wrap up in the next couple of minutes anyway, but let's just give Emily a moment to reconnect, shall we?
Yeah, and my doctor's call might be coming up any minute, so
yes,
so I might have to run if that happens.
Okay, well, in that case, let me just finish my rambling finale, and then we'll...
Rambling Sid Rumpo, do you remember him?
Yeah.
Ramble on, James.
Yeah, well, thank you for writing this book. It feels like there's work to be done still in terms of fleshing out that chapter 10, as we said earlier, and sort of like being clearer about what is the prescription, or what is a range of prescriptions. And we need to bring people into that conversation because it's very contextually bound, right? And we need to be having conversations with people about what might this look like? How come I'd be more embodied in my own life, in my practice, in our department, in our year group, in the context of maths, art, PE, PA, whatever it might be, around in the way that the classroom is laid out. There are all kinds of implications for these kind of fundamental insights, but you've done a magnificent job of laying out the science, and there's so many sort of just brilliant, that you've got such an excellent command of language. I love the just the way that you write. It's very, very, very readable. And so, as a final thing, if I may, while we have a minute, if there was a billboard, if you could just if there was one slogan from this book, this could be your own words, they could be somebody else's. If there was one slogan that you could put on a billboard that would go onto the wall of every teacher training institution in the country, or every staff room, what would it be?
Oh, that's tricky. Bring back curiosity. I mean, a lot of people are writing and talking about curiosity. Bill Lucas is fond of saying that curiosity is the engine of learning. And I think that metaphor is very powerful. It's like, if only a lot of the things that concern people about what goes on in school are only there because what is happening doesn't have much purchase or much relevance, much sense of meaningfulness, much individual scope for developing different passions and different interests. It's not hard stuff to put your finger on. It's just hard to shift the old assumptions of what's always been going on. So yeah, bring back curiosity, more independent learning time.
I love it. Thank you. And Emily, I know you dipped out for a moment there. I was just there's a very final question. We've just done some wrapping up. If there was one sort of key idea, one slogan, one piece of advice that you would like to share with educators about this work, what would it be?
That learning is a full body activity. Full body, full person activity.
Love it. Nice and succinct. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for that. It's been really, really interesting conversation.
Yeah, likewise. And thank you both for your close reading of the book. That's a real compliment to have people engage with your work so well, so thoughtfully, in some ways challenging, which is always good, providing it's coming from a nice place. And thank you for the opportunity for us, as we used to say in the 1960s, to strut our stuff.
Excellent.
Yes, thanks from me too. It was a great conversation.
How it is and how it should be, racing in the streets again. One's got the other by its expectations. The other is going for a submission. Hope has stoicism by the neck. Acceptance is struggling for breath. the fall. Come early this year. That bridge should be finished this year. You can go